Typically, when we hear about Indian removals or we think about um, Indian removal policy, we think of Andrew Jackson. And so, what I want to correct about that is that there has always been an Indian removal policy from early on in American history, going long before Andrew Jackson. And so I want to get into this lecture by establishing the essentially the evolution of Indian removal policy. Essentially, it begins with uh, Thomas Jefferson, and it ends with Andrew Jackson. And what we're going to talk about is what it is defined as, how it's justified, what it means, the processes that it goes through, the messages, all of it. And so when we get into the whole idea of Indian policy in general, what I want you to understand is there's always been this idea of Indian removal. Even going into George Washington, there has always been this idea of getting Indian peoples, native peoples in general, out of the way. How do we remove them and make way for Indian settlement? In fact, in the last lecture, remember that in the initial treaties with Native peoples, um, there is an agreement made with the Southeastern Indians in particular to give up tracts of land, right? And so when you have um, the agreement to give up tracts of land even for the purpose of military posts or trading posts, there is the assumption that, well, if they're willing to give up tracts of land for this purpose, maybe they're willing to give up tracts of land for the purpose of giving that over to us where we can occupy it for the sake of us living on it, right? So I want to talk about the roots of removal policy for the sake of um, resettlement, American settlement. But I want to talk about where Indian removal policy comes from in the context of Thomas Jefferson's presidency. So I've got to go back to talking about Lewis and Clark for a second. So the Lewis and Clark expedition initiates this new era of interest in the American West. And Lewis and Clark really sort of exposes the vastness of the continent. It exposes how geographically different the continent is, the kinds of differences it offers in plants, in animals, the kinds of lands, weather, climate, all of that stuff that the land has to offer. And so um in that fascination and in this need to want to discover those things and explore those things, um you also have the realization that there are all of these different tribes living out there. One of the things that you should know is that with the expedition, Jefferson sends dozens of letters with Lewis and Clark. And the letters are addressed to the various tribes that Lewis and Clark are expected to encounter along their journey. The tribes will include the Mandan tribe. The Mandan tribe are particularly influential in their region. That's how Jefferson knows of them, because the Mandans will deal with the French quite a bit. So the Mandan tribe, the Cherokee tribe. He sends letters, and not the Cherokee tribe, but there are several tribes that he sends letters to. The Delaware, the Shawnee, uh, members of the different Algonquian nations. Um, there are all sorts of tribes that will receive messages of essentially peace and friendship. And Jefferson presents himself almost as always as a friend, but in some cases, even as a father figure. And essentially, the idea is that he wants to present himself in this way to negotiate a peaceful relationship. And I especially want to talk about the message that he gives to the Delaware and the Shawnee, because the Delaware and the Shawnee actually send delegates to Washington, D.C., to meet with representatives of the federal government. And Jefferson actually meets with them, and he gives them this message. He says that he would, and I quote, pay the most sacred regard to existing treaties between your respective nations and ours. In other words, I am going to continue to adhere to and respect the treaties that we have signed between us. So the treaties that we have with you, the Delaware, and with you, the Shawnee, and let me continue the quote, and protect your whole territories against all intrusions that may be attempted by white people. In other words, if Americans, or if the British, who still occupy Canada, because he knows this is a real threat. This is continuing. Remember, for those of you who remember from your early American history class, the British not only occupy and control Canada, they are still very much occupying, British troops are still very much occupying space along the Canadian border and harassing people by just crossing over the border. And this is a real threat for people, particularly Native people. And so essentially, Jefferson is like, you know what? Don't worry, we've got you. We've got your back. If white people, including white Americans, are threatening you and threatening your space, they're taking your hunting grounds, we've got you. We've got your back. We're going to protect you. We're going to look out for you. We're going to make sure that you are not harassed. We're going to make sure that your territory is protected, and we're going to make sure that you don't have to deal with squatters. And remember, that is something that I mentioned to you in the very first lecture. Squatters are a threat from the get-go. White squatters are a threat from the get-go. They believe that that because America purchases the land, that suddenly they have the right to all of this territory, regardless of the fact that there are treaties that settle boundaries, treaties with these native peoples. They don't care. They will occupy the land and turn it into something for themselves. And here's Jefferson saying, nope, we've got your back. We're going to respect these treaties. But I want to point out that Jefferson is giving a different message to Congress. And the message to Congress is, we have to be careful with how much land we are giving to these native peoples. And the thing is the reason why he's giving this warning is, he says, if you give them too much land, it is a disincentive for them to become quote unquote civilized. In other words, if they have too much land, they're going to want to stick to this idea of um, being the way that they are. If you limit how much land they have no choice but to evolve. They have no choice but to be farmers like us. They have no choice but to assimilate. So, in other words, don't give them too much land. Don't allow them to have, uh, as much land as we've usually been giving them. Uh, Jefferson feared that native peoples would continue to hunt, that they would continue their traditional native ways rather than, becoming farmers, rather than assimilating. So what he tells Congress is we have to restrict their choices, right? Now, this is despite the fact that by the time he becomes president of the United States, remember he's elected in 1800, so he becomes president of the United States in 1801. By 1801, most of the native peoples in the eastern half of the United States, especially the southeastern tribes, most of them had become, agrarian societies. Most of them had adopted these farming traditions. So he is making all sorts of things up. He's not fully accepting the fact that a lot of these people had already assimilated, and it's not going to take he he's it's not going to take that much for them to assimilate. um so he says to them, he says to Congress, we have to show native people that hunting is essentially useless. Once they learn to farm, that hunting is essentially useless. And in fact, this is the quote that he gives to Congress. They being native peoples, they will perceive how useless to them are their extensive forests, and will be willing to pare them off from time to time in exchange for necessaries for their farms and families. In other words, what he's saying is native peoples are going to realize that having all of this land is a waste. It's a waste of space. And they'd be willing to give up all of that extra space if we would be willing to give them the stuff that they would need to farm. So if we'd be willing to trade with them, like give them the farming tools, the seeds, the equipment, whatever, in exchange for all of that land that they'd be willing to give up, it'd be a fair trade. And here's the other thing. He also makes the argument that more American settlement would push native peoples either to be incorporated into American society, right? It would force them to assimilate, or be removed beyond the Mississippi River, right? To go further west. That's what we mean by, this idea of moving, removal. So let's talk about the native response to Jefferson. The native peoples are going to um, fight back as much as they can. They're going to fight for their land because, it is ancestrally theirs. Um, However, they were suppressed by the American government, and dictated by treaties, right? There were 30 treaties with, over a dozen tribal groups. Um, and in these 30 treaties, they gave up almost 200,000 square miles of land. That was essentially, you know, covering, well, it was included in about 9 states of land, right? So 200,000 square miles of land. And when we talk about where they would have to move, they're all having to move out west, right? They'd have to, because everyone's coming in through the east. Everyone's crossing the Atlantic and settling on the along the eastern seaboard, or somewhere in the east of the Mississippi River. Um, and so that means that native people have to move west. Um, and as time goes on, there is increased pressure to move west. Now, when we talk about this whole idea of resettlement, um, resettlement is essentially presented as a choice, right? If you didn't want to assimilate, it's a choice. If you don't want to assimilate, you can settle in a distant, protected region until you agree to assimilate. That's how Jefferson presents it. If you don't want to assimilate, if you want to hunt, if you want to continue your traditional ways, then move west. And then when you're ready to assimilate, you can come back. That's the idea. So you can live out west somewhere in the middle of nowhere in that Louisiana Purchase region. And then when you're ready, you can come back. This is the idea of encouraging Native peoples to settle in that massive amount of land that's been purchased, right? But when we talk about who has been resettling, I want to mention that we've got quite a bit of people who are actually resettling. So there are several tribes that actually move out west, and I'm going to list them all here, but there are specific places they go and certain numbers. So I've got them listed here, but I want you to pay attention to what I'm saying. You're going to have to pause at some places so you can write this down. So this is me just warning you. You're going to probably pause in a couple of spots so you have a chance to write this down, okay? So let's start with the Delaware and the Shawnee. So the Delaware and the Shawnee, here's the list of the tribes that I'm going to mention. So the Delaware and the Shawnee were were living in Ohio. They moved from Ohio to northeastern Arkansas. And then from northeastern Arkansas, they moved to southeastern Oklahoma and lived by the Canadian River. Um, and that's going to be important for you to remember. So I'm just going to say that again. Uh, they moved twice. So the Delaware and the Shawnee lived in Ohio, moved to northeastern Arkansas, and then moved again to southeastern Oklahoma and lived by the Canadian River. So then there's the Choctaw. The Choctaw, only 1,000 of them, so not the entire tribe, 1,000 Choctaw crossed the Mississippi River and settled, excuse me, settled in the Red River Valley. So we're talking about the southern border of present day Oklahoma, lived in the Red River Valley. So just 1,000 Choctaw, not the entire tribe. The same goes for the Cherokee. Notice that I put the Cherokee in italics. I italicized the name. There's a reason why. So 300 members of the Cherokee tribe moved to Arkansas. They joined other members of the Cherokee tribe who were already living there and had been living there for a decade already. Um, so there were members of the Cherokee tribe who had already been living in Arkansas for a decade already. 300 more joined them. By 1817, 6,000 Cherokee lived west of the Mississippi River. That is not, I'm going to say this again, that is not the entire tribe. That is only 1/3 of the Cherokee tribe. That is only 1/3 of the Cherokee tribe. Okay. So the rest of the tribe, 2/3 of the tribe, are still living in the southeastern part of the United States. So Georgia and in that region, Georgia and part of the Carolinas, that's where the rest of them are living. In Arkansas, though, 1817, that you've got 6,000 of them living there. Now, I want to talk about Um, well, we've talked about who's moving where. I want to talk about why this is problematic. Okay. There are already other native peoples living in this region. This is the problem. There are already other people living there. We've talked about them, right? We've talked about the Wichita, the Apache, the Osage, the Kiowa are living in western Oklahoma. So you are now talking about new tribes coming into an area that is already occupied, which is going to lead to competition for land, competition for food. It is going to be incredibly problematic, right? Think about this for a second. Remember, this is not an issue because this is, you know, there is a racial component here, a racial assumption that a lot of people make about this. Oh, that these native peoples are uncivilized and they can't control each other and they don't know how to manage their own behavior. But remember, the British colonists and the French had this same problem not very long before, which is what led to the French Indian War here in North America. And that is, you know, control of the space and having access to resources. It is the tale of human history, and this is essentially what leads to this problem of assumptions about these quote unquote Indians, that Indians are all one and the same. They are all, you know, able to get along well. They all have the same traditions. They all have the same belief systems. They all can just occupy the same space. And therefore, because they all look alike, think alike, dress alike, whatever, it's all going to be just fine. And that's not at all what happens. They have these unique traditions, the unique cultures, unique languages, unique governments, unique ways of life, and this is going to lead to trouble. When we talk about what this trouble is, the most significant is what's known as the Red War for the West. Now, when we talk about Red War for the West, notice I put that in quotation marks because Red War for the West has racist connotations for it. But the war itself is essentially about this competition for resources. The Osage will feel this the most. They are going to feel this the hardest, right? You have other native peoples who come into this area claiming to be farmers, but here they are, you know, claiming this agricultural identity, but are hunting for deer, hunting for bears. Um, and the Osage are like, wait a second, y'all are supposed to be farmers. How come y'all are hunting? Um, so when the Osage see these new people show up and start hunting, the hunters were attacked naturally. They were attacked, robbed, and then quickly killed. The Cherokee are going to react the same way when they see other tribes um, hunting buffalo on the prairie. This is going to be really problematic. And when all of this violence breaks out um, all over the issue of hunting, um, what the Americans realize is this is not something that they can readily ignore, right? This is something that has to be dealt with, and it has to be dealt with immediately. So that's where, let me go back a second. That's where Lovely's Purchase comes in. So I want to explain um, who William Lovely is. So William Lovely was the assistant agent to the Cherokee. So assistant agent means he was actually working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he was appointed to work specifically with the Cherokee. And he was named the agent to the Western Cherokee, specifically in Arkansas, um, in 1813. And um, when we talk about this particular purchase, Lovely's purchase, um, it was um, a certain tract of land that was purchased to serve as a buffer, essentially a buffer between um, the tribes, the Osage and Cherokee tribes, um, to allow for a little bit of peace, right? When we talk about these agreements, there are treaties that are written and signed in 1808 and 1816. And here's what ends up happening. The Osage gave up huge amounts of land for the exclusive use of people who ended up moving into the region. In exchange, the Osage would receive gifts, they would receive cash payments, and the cancellation of debt. Um, and when we talk about, the kinds of payments they would also get, um, we one of the things they would get in terms of payments is in this war they had lost several warriors and they would receive compensation for the loss of their warriors. So the Osage would be getting quite a bit. The Western Cherokee um, are really struggling with this. The Western Cherokee are angry and frustrated with this particular agreement. The Osage are fine with it. The Osage have been dealing with the Europeans for a long time, right? The Osage had a long history with the Spanish, followed by a long history with the French. And so this sort of deal is not new for them. But the Western Cherokee, this is new. And the Western Cherokee felt like this was not nearly enough. There's no treaty or no payment that would serve as an atonement for the number of warriors that they had lost. And for them, they required blood revenge. There was not enough land that they could get that would be nearly enough for them. So in October of 1817, they joined up with members of the Choctaw tribe, members of Chickasaw tribe, and 500 of them, 500 Cherokees, plus members of the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, attacked an Osage settlement while the Osage were away on a hunt and killed 83 Osage and took 103 women and children as captives. Plus, they stole stuff, they burned the village, they destroyed the food. Um, and in terms of the American response, um, when they realized, okay, Lovely's purchase was not something that actually dealt with anything, nor did it resolve anything, the American response was, okay, well, let's keep this from getting even worse, uh, and keep the Osage from, making this even bigger. The Secretary of War ordered that the Army speed up plans to build a fort on the Arkansas River. And if you remember this, I don't know if you do, but the Arkansas River um, is very near the Osage boundary. This is important because that was where Three Forks was. Three Forks, of course, is that huge trading post area, and that's very important for the Osage. So the Arkansas River is near the Osage boundary, and that's where you would get eventually the establishment of Fort Smith. The construction began in December of 1817. And in the meantime, the fighting between the Osage and the Cherokee continued. Um, so that's with Fort Smith. Fort Smith, as you know, is in Arkansas. So on the other side, in present day Oklahoma, you have the construction of Fort Gibson. Fort Gibson was constructed in 1824 in northeastern Oklahoma and that was specifically to keep an eye on the Osage. The Osage are really impressed with Fort Gibson. Um, Primarily because they were impressed with the amount of force and strength shown. And um, because of that, they eventually give up all of the land that they had in Oklahoma and move to Kansas. So they move into Kansas. I'm going to go back for a second. They move up into Kansas and settle there for the time being, and allow themselves the space that they need to resettle and grow, and gain their numbers. Uh, but one of the things that it sort of teaches the Americans is that this whole idea of resettlement is not just a matter of, pushing this message of moving native peoples anywhere and everywhere and it would be easy. The problem though with that is that Americans forget these lessons relatively quickly. Um, because at the same time, you start to see a lot of Americans um, only with their eyes on land and not giving any thought to native presence whatsoever. And that leads me to this point, and that is Americans just moving in whenever it's readily convenient for them. Um, Americans start to move in to the western Arkansas and Red River Valley region, which is very problematic. We're talking about the kind of squatters that were referred to in the first lecture, but we're also talking about really problematic people who were criminals, who were escaping the law, robbers, murderers, moonshiners, and these guys controlled the area. Um, and this was how it went pre 1824, um, before the establishment of Fort Towson. Um, when we talk about this region, what especially before the presence of military posts were absolutely essential, not just in Oklahoma, but throughout the American West. That's going to be important for you to remember as well. You need these military posts because military posts policed the region of the American West. And they policed the region of the American West because without military posts, Native Americans were harassed by white migrants who thought they could have access to all of the land, all of the hunting, all of the whatever, and do whatever they want, control whatever they want. And that was really problematic, right? So you needed these American military posts. They policed the area and kept the peace. And that's incredibly important for you to remember. One of the other things is um, when we talk about the presence of Americans in this region, I've got to bring back the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which I mentioned in the previous lecture. So the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, remember, was made up of these multiple denominations, who, were all Protestant denominations, right? Um, so Epaphras Chapman and 17 of his co-workers established uh, a Protestant mission among the Osage in 1820. And by 1820, um, the Osage had returned into northern and northeastern Oklahoma, um, or they were already in Oklahoma. So this was just before they moved into Kansas. So just this was a few years before they left. So in 1820, Epaphras Chapman and 17 of his fellow missionaries established what was known as the Union Mission. And the Union Mission builds the first school in Oklahoma. Um, and it's the same sort of purpose, the same sort of vision that the American Board of Commissioners had with the Southeastern Indians. And that is reach out, contact these tribes, connect with them with the purpose of education, and then try to convert them from there, right? Um, it's the Osage react in the same sort of way that the southeastern tribes react, and that is the Osage were essentially indifferent, right? The Union Mission having the purpose of these sort of religious beliefs. Um, the Osage were like, "Listen, we're just trying to maintain a presence here. Um, we're trying to maintain our control in the region. The Cherokee are bothering us. We don't really like the Cherokee. Y'all don't have to um, bother us. I mean, if you're going to build a school, that'd be great." And that's about it, right? So when we talk about this relationship between the two, it's not really as friendly as, say, the Cherokee had with guys like Samuel Worcester. Um, you know, when we talk about, like, for example, war breaks out with the Cherokee again pretty soon. Um, and these guys, Epaphras Chapman, really, really pressured them to settle down, to become farmers, focus on your trade, work with the Shoto more, work with the Shoto outfit more, but you know do more of that farming thing, trade the things that you farm, trade the things that you produce. And the Osage were like, well, why would we, trade what we produce from the ground when we actually make way more money off of what we hunt? The Osage were like, we make way more profit from what we hunt. And isn't that the capitalist thing to do? What ends up happening is, you have a lot of pressure um, from Chapman and the others to assimilate. And the Osage were like, No, not really. This is not going to work out great." So, for example, Chapman and the other missionaries are going to try to build log houses, log cabins for the Osage to live in. In 1824, just before the Osage leave for Kansas, there are very few Osage families who actually live in these things. They're not interested in these log cabins. I mean, they have no kind of desire to live in these things. So it's there's the idea of assimilation doesn't really appeal to them. And Chapman is sort of sitting there going, well, then what's the point, right? Listen, the Osage have connected with the Spanish, the French, and now the Americans, but they've connected in ways that are specific and beneficial to them. And it's worked for them for decades upon decades upon decades. Why would they want to change now? Um, when we talk about the clashes and the problems that they have, it's really on these ideological principles, right? Um, they are not going to convert. They are not going to change their way of life. They are not going to give up what has been the most economically beneficial. And this is very problematic for Epaphras Chapman. Um, so that leads me into this new kind of strategy of assimilation and removal, taken on by none other than James Monroe. So James Monroe, just to give you a little bit of context, James Monroe, in terms of, and I hate this terminology, but it's used and overused so much, that I'll use it anyway. It's He is considered the youngest of that founding fathers generation, right? Monroe is um, considered a mentee of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. He's the fifth president. He's he's considered the guy who learned at the hands of Madison and Jefferson. In fact, Madison and Jefferson are the guys who bought his, found the land for his house and all of that stuff, right? So he sees them as, big brother figures, and almost father figures. Monroe, by the time he becomes president, has um, seen older Indian removal policies and has learned from them, has his own ideas. He also has a very learned Secretary of State in John Quincy Adams. And so he takes a very his own unique approach to Indian removal. And he says that when it comes to Indian removal, that civilization cannot happen where Native people already live. In other words, they cannot live on their ancestral land and evolve. So if they have lived in Georgia for the past 300 years, you can't expect them to evolve there. They have to leave. Um, but he also very strongly believes that you cannot force them to leave, right? You cannot pressure them and say that if you don't do this, then we are going to, you know, use the military and kick you out. So instead, uh, he says, we have to entice them to leave, right? We've got to give them a reason to leave. And what he says is that the best way to do that is give them an exchange of land, right? So enticement means a temptation, right? Give them a reason, a gift, a proposal, that sort of thing. So in this particular case, and it's an exchange of land. Um, so when it comes to the different tribes, um, this is going to be really a very interesting, um, an interesting situation, because the Western Cherokees are in a unique predicament. The Western Cherokees had no legal claim to the land that they occupied in Arkansas. Um, and the reason why that's really problematic is they had daily disputes with the white settlers who decided to claim those lands. And so the white settlers would lodge complaints with the federal government saying these native people are in the way. We want to live on this land, and we're Americans, and so we should be able to live here freely without Indian encroachment. And the native people are like, well, we have lived here for this many years. and these white people just showed up, we should be able to um, live here without white encroachment. Um, so these Western Cherokees were led by their principal chief, John Jolly, Jolly. Um, he enabled his people, the Western Cherokees, to defend themselves naturally. And he essentially said that you should be able to protect yourself from any kind of white encroachment, um, so that you could protect whatever you owned and wherever you lived from white settlers. So the solution was to figure out how to stop any kind of violence that was taking place, right? So that led to the Treaty of Washington of 1828, right? And essentially, what the Treaty of 1828, the Treaty of Washington says, was that the Western Cherokee would exchange these lands in Arkansas for territory in northeastern Oklahoma, in addition to a perpetual outlet that was 57 miles wide that extended to the western border of Oklahoma. So let me get my trusty pen out here. Okay, so essentially, you're going to have, so as this little indicator says, um, this is the land that the treaty has marked out specifically for the Western Cherokees. This was their land previously, right? That land was essentially, I'm going to clear the screen for a second. So this was the land that they previously occupied. This is what the treaty is now giving them, right? So this is now their new land, plus this, which is now known as the Cherokee Outlet. Now, this is what they're saying is 57 miles wide. This right here, 57 miles wide, going north and south, 57 miles wide, and stretching across this area right here is the Cherokee Outlet, and they're promised it for perpetually. So forever, that's going to be theirs. Now, in addition to that, the United States promised, that's important, promised to remove all white people from the new Cherokee Nation. It promised to remove all white people from the new Cherokee Nation. So I'm going to put a big X mark over here, so to indicate there are no white people allowed in that new Cherokee reservation. Okay? Furthermore, the Western Cherokees would be compensated. All right? They would be compensated for all improvements made to this land. Remember, when they moved here, by the time the Cherokees, remember, there had been Cherokees who had moved from the southeastern part into Arkansas. Those were people who had become farmers and that sort of thing. Any improvements they had made to the land, they would be compensated for. And furthermore, they would be paid to move out west. So I'm going to make that green as well to indicate money. So there's your little money sign there. So paid for moving, paid for improvements. The government also agreed to buy the Cherokee Nation a printing press so that they could print out whatever they needed, a newspaper, whatever, books, Bibles, that sort of thing. Um, the government promised, so notice there are all sorts of promises here. The government promised money for 10 years to support tribal schools. 10 years to support tribal schools. The government would also pay for the cost of removal and subsistence for a year. By subsistence, I mean they are going to pay for whatever the Cherokee needed, food, supplies, whatever, for the following year. So think about all the things listed in that treaty that the government is promising to do. Within a year, 3,000 Western Cherokees moved. Within a year. So this is quite a promise here with this treaty, right? Um, and when we talk about all of the availability here, all of the enticements here, it's quite a bit. Monroe is serious here, and decides to extend that to other other tribes. So with the Choctaw, for example, um, he tried to get the Choctaw to exchange part of their eastern domain for a tract of land in the west. So in 1820, um, he presented to them the Treaty of Doak's Stand. So the Choctaw had lands in Mississippi, and what he wanted was 5 million acres of land. And here's what he basically says to them: I need you to give up 5 million acres of land. In exchange for your 5 million acres of land, we will give you 13 million acres of land in the southern half of Oklahoma. In the southern half of Oklahoma and in the southwest corner of Arkansas. So essentially, if I get my handy dandy pen out again, um, so we are talking about the southern half of Oklahoma, so extending here and going into a little bit of Arkansas, but it's 13 million acres of land um, in Oklahoma, part and a little bit of Arkansas. When we talk about the other benefits promised to the Choctaw, there are educational benefits as well as money to support their police force. They would also get a resident agent in the West, as well as assistance to those who moved to their new domain. Now, here is the problem with this particular treaty. In terms of the area in southwest Arkansas, uh, it is heavily settled by white frontiersmen. And it is so heavily settled by white frontiersmen that these white frontiersmen had already organized the area into counties. So there was a large population of white people in southwest Arkansas. Uh, so you can imagine that these white early Arkansans, how outraged they were by this. There was a tremendous amount of political pressure that had forced federal officials to essentially renegotiate the eastern boundary of the Choctaw land in 1825. And they set that eastern boundary at a line due south from the Arkansas River. By 1826, a federal agent oversaw construction of buildings for his agency about 15 miles southwest of Fort Smith. So, um, you know, they had to really, essentially, you've got this treaty that's created with no consideration of the potential danger for the Choctaw. But here's the thing, in 1829, or by 1829, by the year 1829, only 150 Indians, only 150 members of the Choctaw tribe had actually responded to the invitation to move. So the Cherokee were willing to move, the Choctaw were not, right? What about? Oh, I'm so sorry, but I forgot to mention Pushmataha, and he is significant, and he's there. He's right here staring at me. So Pushmataha um, is significant in this narrative, primarily because when we talk about Pushmataha and the reason for this resistance to this whole idea of enticement, and the idea of um, the idea uh, that you should even participate in something like land exchange. One of the things you should consider is this: Pushmataha is um, one of the prime examples of native leaders who will take stands against the federal government, um, in giving up um, ancestral land. Um, what's interesting is that, you know, he actually, like in the War of 1812, he will fight, he will choose the side of the United States, right? He's a chief for the Choctaws, and the Choctaws will sign an alliance with the United States against the British. So it's not like he is always against the United States, but it's not like, again, it's not like he has a loyalty to the United States. But he, in 1824, travels to Washington, D.C., specifically to, protest um, and petition the federal government against, giving up more and more Choctaw land, right? This is a man who is considered um, the greatest, or one of the greatest, if not the greatest, chief of the Choctaw Nation, and certainly one of the greatest Choctaw military leaders. And one of the things that um, people don't realize is he is widely respected even by the Americans. I mean, even Andrew Jackson, um, he will at one point have this very frank and problematic confrontation with Andrew Jackson at one point. And um, Andrew Jackson is um, he is not intimidated at all by Andrew Jackson. Um, and Andrew Jackson is sort of taken aback by Pushmataha because he feels like Pushmataha should be intimidated by him. He is, after all, Andrew Jackson. And um, Pushmataha is one of these men who sort of um, makes it clear that the leaders of Native people are going to be a source of trouble, right? So to speak, in terms of, you know, wanting to hold on to the dignity, the integrity, the identity of Native culture and history. And that's something that I want you to remember. We've gone over the problems already, so I want to quickly move on and get into what happens with the Creeks. Okay, so with the Creeks, initially the Creeks rejected every and all proposals to exchange land, and then in 1824, um, at the National Council of the Creek Confederation, um, when there was a meeting, there was a presentation of an exchange of land. Um, there was this presentation that, um, you know, the tribe could exchange lands and receive much larger estates in the West. Um, And at this meeting, they decided, uh, even with the discussion about the exchange in 1824, um, that anyone, and this is what you have to remember, anyone who signed away tribal lands without council approval would be executed. This is at the 1824 National Council of the Creek Confederation. Anyone who signed away tribal lands without council approval would be executed, not kicked out of the tribe, not, you know, not removed, not, I mean, they would be executed, period. So, William McIntosh, who is pictured here, um, was chief of the Lower Creeks. Now, here's what you have to understand. Um, the Creeks are very heavily, deeply divided between traditionalists and progressives. Um, so those who wanted to keep their tribal heritage and their identity are very much married to that belief. And those who are willing to adapt, willing to change, are very much married to that belief. And it is a division that only grows stronger as the years go by. William McIntosh is the chief of the Lower Creeks. And by Lower Creeks, I mean Lower Creeks is actually a geographical connotation. So there is the Upper Creek towns, and there are Lower Creek towns. Um, And when we talk about the Lower Creek towns, the reason why it's geographically set aside is because the creeks had grown so much, they had expanded so much that the National Council of the Creek Confederation decided to divide the Creek nation into two so that it would be easier to govern them. So you would have a chief in charge of the Upper Creeks and a chief in charge of the Lower Creeks, and they would manage them that way. So William McIntosh was chief of the Lower Creeks, and McIntosh was actually a progressive, who argued that the salvation of the tribe was dependent on moving out west. He said, listen, if we are going to get through this time period, if we are actually going to survive, we're going to have to get out of here. We're going to have to give up this land and move. And the very fact that he would even say that, keep in mind, he hasn't signed anything. He hasn't signed anything. He's just saying it. The fact that he would say that we've got to go out west in order to survive. The traditional Creeks in the Lower Creeks were offended by the idea. So in April of 1825, 100 warriors surrounded his home, set it on fire, and he was assassinated. That's how he died. These people are not messing around. Okay. When we talk about how deeply divided, um, how deeply they feel this idea of tradition and anti-assimilation, they are, it is very real, right? Um, Progressives and traditionalists are not just in the Creeks, but it is best exemplified in the Creeks. That's what you need to know. It is best exemplified in the Creeks, but it is in every tribe, just so you understand. Um, okay, so let's move on to John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams um, is profoundly impacted. He's profoundly affected by what happens to McIntosh. Um, when he realizes, because listen, John Quincy Adams is um, Monroe's Secretary of State. So he is a big fan of the idea of enticement. He knows that there is nothing, and John Quincy Adams, might I say, incredibly intelligent, very well read, and knows that there's nothing that's going to stop white settlement. So what he's trying to do is save native native peoples and native population, um but at the same time, this idea that this man who was trying to save his people would be assassinated just over the thought of moving out west, just over the thought of enticement, is very scary to him. So he says, okay, how do we work around this? In 1826, he invites representatives of the Creek tribe to come to DC. So the National Council of the Creek Confederation authorized a delegation to give up lands in Georgia if necessary. And they hoped that the land exchange could, avert a civil war between those who supported McIntosh and those who, caused his assassination. Um, and essentially, what this comes down to is um, what they're hoping for is McIntosh supporters would move and the traditionalists could stay at the very least. So maybe traditionalists could have a few more years in Georgia and the progressives could go out west, and maybe that could avoid a civil war. Um, and essentially, that's what happens. All the Creek lands in Georgia were exchanged for land in Indian Territory, which is, of course, present day Oklahoma, between the Arkansas and Canadian rivers. The move itself would be paid for by the federal government. Um, and essentially, these changes, you know, that that when we talk about this exchange or this sort of, you know, this move, um, it separates the tribe, but it sort of sets this trend of, okay, well, it establishes peace for right now, but only for right now. It buys them a little bit of time. It's not great, but it buys them some time. When I say it buys them some time, let me just say it's only for a few years, because Forced removal is coming. And it's what William McIntosh knows, right? That's the thing that traditionalists weren't willing to listen to. Um, that's the tragedy here. Jackson is coming. And the thing about Andrew Jackson is, and you might know this from, if you've taken the Jackson class with Professor Gates, you might remember, um, you know, Jackson has a very long, complicated history of a personal history of being um, a quote unquote Indian fighter of some kind. But he also has, you know, this reputation of being an ally to, um, having commanded the Seminoles during his time during his time of service in the War of 1812. Um, you know, I mean, this is the thing. Like when we talk about, oh, I forgot to mention this. Let me go back for a second. I'm so sorry. Um, I wanted to mention with the Creeks and their move, they were promised. Uh, they were promised compensation and assistance once they actually arrived in Oklahoma. Um, so like $100,000 once they arrived and that sort of thing. So within 2 years of them arriving in Indian Territory, 2,400 members of the Creek tribe um, arrived here, most of them from Lower Creek towns. And the promises of the treaty were not delivered in the first 2 years of them being here, and there was a lot of hardship as a result. Let me just say that. I completely forgot to add that. So, in the first 2 years that they lived here, they really struggled. So, let me just say that. Just to kind of add to that, to the struggle that bridges me into the struggle of Andrew Jackson and his experience with Native people. So when we talk about Andrew Jackson, Jackson's going to present this argument that Native people are uncultured, uncivilized, that they will never learn, they will never evolve. And that is despite the fact that he knew from personal experience that Creeks and Cherokees in particular had, you know, assimilated and adopted agrarian lifestyles, had adopted, constitutional styles of government, you know, had even become slave owners, for crying out loud. Um, he is just someone who is, when it comes right down to it, um, not going to allow Native people to stand in the way of what he believes to be white progress. And he says so. He says so in his message to Congress, which you will read, or you should read, for this week's discussion. Um, when it comes to the whole idea of Indian removal, and his message to Congress, I want you to pay special attention to the kinds of phrases he uses, to the adjectives he uses, um, and that sort of issue. Uh, he'll make these claims, for example, that the native peoples would be left alone in the West, that it was in their best interest, that sort of thing. But it's all nonsense in the end, right? Um, what he's ultimately doing is he's saying all of these things because um, he wants to present this, the Indian Removal Act. Uh, he is removing those tribes primarily, not only them, but primarily those tribes who were already described as civilized. That's the key. He is advocating the removal of tribes already described as quote unquote civilized. These were people who had accommodated to the American ways. They wore European style clothing. They had fenced their lands, plowed their fields. They cultivated corn and cotton. Some of them had even become Christian. They were literate. Some of them held slaves. Um, some of them had intermarried with white people. Others had intermarried with, their slaves. Um, when we talk about uh, this removal policy, um, I think ultimately the best example of resistance, native resistance to the removal policy, comes from the Cherokee. So that's where we're going to spend most of the rest of our time. Um, so the Cherokee restructured their tribal government, as you guys know. Um, in 1827, they modeled it after the United States with a written constitution. They established an independent judiciary, a Supreme Court, a principal chief. They have a two-house legislature. So everything essentially looks exactly like the United States. Furthermore, they established their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, which is established in 1828. They have an editor, Elias Boudinot, Boudinot, um, who was educated at a foreign mission school in Connecticut. The newspaper is published in both Cherokee and in English. And he writes this fantastic editorial in which he says, "You asked us to throw off the hunter and warrior state. We did so. You asked us to form a republican government. We did so, adopting your own as a model. You asked us to cultivate the earth and learn the mechanic arts. We did so. You asked us to learn to read. We did so. You asked us to cast away our idols and worship your God. We did so." That particular editorial was written by John Ridge. And in it, essentially, you can hear what he's arguing, right? We've done the assimilation things that you have asked us to do, and you're still making us leave. So, why is he especially demanding the removal? Why is Jackson um so demanding of this particular removal? It's going to come from this push for white settlement in Georgia, particularly because of the discovery of gold. Well, why else? I want to explain the influence and the importance of gold in this area. So, Cherokee territory originally extended into five southeastern states, but by the 1820s, most remaining Cherokees were confined to Georgia. And somewhere in 1827, gold had been discovered in Cherokee country. And of course, the moment that gold is discovered, prospectors come flooding into the area, right? All somebody has to say is gold. And that's all it takes. You don't even have to actually discover gold. There just needs to be rumor of it. But this time, gold was actually discovered there. So by December of 1827, the Georgia legislature passed a resolution asserting its sovereignty over Cherokee lands within the state's borders. Essentially, what the state of Georgia was trying to do was basically say, if you live within the state of Georgia, you have to do what we are telling you to do, and your sovereignty is actually subject to our authority. And what they were really ultimately trying to do was force the Cherokees to give up their land to the state of Georgia. So what Georgia did was they started to harass the Cherokee Nation, intimidate the tribe. They were, um, lying to the people, doing whatever. I mean, the state legislature started to pass laws specifically aimed at the Cherokees with the intent of destroying the Cherokee Nation, and they weren't even hiding from it. I mean, they're doing a terrible job of lying about it. Um, here are some examples of some of the laws they passed. So the state legislature passed laws that prohibited meetings of the tribal council. They closed down the tribal courts. They deprived the Cherokees of the right to legally protest. It was illegal for the Cherokees to testify in court against white people. It was illegal for the Cherokee to dig for gold. Um, it was illegal for a member of the Cherokee tribe to convince another member of the Cherokee to stay on Cherokee lands rather than move. That's the kicker. Um, so you know, so essentially you were being, as a member of the Cherokee tribe, you were being robbed of any and all Cherokee autonomy, if you chose to stay on Cherokee lands. They were doing everything in their power to get rid of you. Um, and the purpose of that, of course, was to pressure the Cherokees into moving, right? It was to pressure the Cherokees to give up their lands, to bring in white settlement so that they could bring in as much, um, you know, white settlers and settle as much of Georgia in the name of white people as possible. So that brings me to the lawsuits that will eventually appear um, before the Supreme Court, right? The first one being Worcester v. Georgia. Worcester, of course, referring to Samuel Worcester, the missionary that I had talked about in the previous lecture. So, Worcester files a lawsuit against the state of Georgia based on a law that the state legislature had passed. Yes, another law. So, this particular law claimed that all white people um, had. All white people living in Cherokee Indian Territory had to have a license in order to live there. So, in other words, if you were white and you were living in the Cherokee Nation, you essentially had to have permission from the state to live there. So that essentially is implicating missionaries, right? 7 missionaries refused to get this license. Uh, Chief among them is, of course, Samuel Worcester. Um, Worcester said, "Screw this! I'm not going to get a license. I'm not going to um, ask the state of Georgia for permission to minister to the Cherokees. The Cherokees are a sovereign nation, and the Cherokees don't. If the Cherokees are okay with me being here, then why do I need to ask the state of Georgia?" So the lawsuit makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a quote, and I'm going to make you, I would like for you to make sure that you are writing this down. So make sure that you take your time, pause this when necessary so you can write this down. But the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a quote, distinct community occupying its own territory, end quote, in which, quote, the laws of Georgia can have no force, end quote. The laws of Georgia can have no force. In other words, Georgia's rules do not apply here. Georgia's laws have no say here. The Cherokee Nation is a distinct community. That's what's important here. That is what is incredibly important here. Okay. That leads me to this next lawsuit. The next lawsuit is also filed in 1831, and this is specifically from the Cherokee Nation. So the Cherokee Nation files a lawsuit against Georgia, um, specifically about. So this is referring to the laws that had been, you know, passed against the Cherokee Nation, and the Supreme Court rules. Listen, Georgia lacks the jurisdiction to pass laws against the Cherokee Nation. Georgia lacked the jurisdiction. In other words, Georgia doesn't have the right to pass any kind of laws deciding what the Cherokee can and cannot do. Um, and here's how they know. So the Chief Justice at the time, the Supreme Court Chief Justice at the time was John Marshall. John Marshall, if you guys remember from American history, um, from your early American history survey, is incredibly significant. He's the guy who um, is cousin to Thomas Jefferson. He's pretty significant, so make sure you remember who he is. He's a guy who also helps to determine jurisprudence, all that stuff. So make sure you know who John Marshall is. But Marshall basically says, listen, the state of Georgia has no place here. The reason why we know this is because uh, the fact that treaties exist. The United States government signed treaties with the Cherokee Nation. That's why we know that the state of Georgia can't come in and intervene. If the Cherokee Nation was not a sovereign nation, then why did the United States federal government bother to create and sign and negotiate treaties with with just a random group of individuals then, right? The treaties established the sovereignty of the Cherokee people. So Georgia really has no jurisdiction. Now, at the same time, John Marshall also tries to define the exact status of the Cherokee, right? And by extension, not just the Cherokee, by extension, all native tribes living within the United States. And what he says is that native peoples are, quote, our domestic dependent nation. I'm going to say that again. The Cherokees were a, quote, domestic dependent nation. So, in other words, they retained some aspects of their sovereignty through treaties, right? The treaties established their sovereignty, but in other ways, they are still dependent on the United States because they lived within the boundaries of the United States. So, in his ruling, or in his opinion, he says it's like a ward and a guardian. You know, the U.S. government is the guardian, the Cherokee Nation is the ward. The guardian has to look out for the ward, but the ward has a mind of its own. The ward has to make some decisions for itself. So The Cherokee Nation v. Georgia defines the tribe's relationship to the federal government. That's what makes it significant. Cherokee Nation v. Georgia defines the tribe's relationship. By tribes, I mean not just the southeastern tribes, I mean all tribes across the United States. It defines all tribes' relationship to the federal government. Worcester v. Georgia defines the tribe's relationship to the state, like to the states, as in to the state of Oklahoma, to the state of Georgia, to the state of Minnesota. That's what it does. So it's important that you understand that. These two cases are incredibly important. Now, when we talk about these two cases and how Jackson responds, Jackson doesn't care. Jackson says, well, let the Supreme Court enforce their ruling. Jackson says, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want to do. Jackson decided long before gold was discovered in Georgia. Jackson had already decided that the Cherokee were going to leave Georgia, that the Creek were going to leave, that the Choctaw were going to leave. Everybody's leaving and everybody's going out west, right? So by the time all things are said and done, by the time all things are said and done, um, actually, you know what? Let me decide on a better way to do this. Um, Going back to the Indian removal, uh, I want to get to this point. When we talk about Indian removal, um, Indian removal, the Indian Removal Act is defined this way. It authorized the president to negotiate treaties of removal with all Indian tribes living east of the Mississippi River. It authorized the president to negotiate treaties of removal with all Indian tribes living east of the Mississippi River. So, if you lived east of the Mississippi River, regardless of where you were, southeastern United States, northeastern United States, in the Midwest, then you were going to be forced to leave. It did not matter. Now, when we talk about um, this particular policy and the Cherokee resistance, the Cherokees fight back using the law in the hopes that the law would show or demonstrate the hypocrisy of the United States, right? And that would slow the process down. But obviously it did not, because Andrew Jackson doesn't care about hypocrisy, right? Um, Jackson demonstrates that early on. Jackson knew early on that that the southeastern tribes had adapted and assimilated, and he still wanted them removed, right? So he doesn't care. That's what leads me to the Treaty of New Eshota in 1836. So this is a treaty that is signed with a minority group of the Cherokees who actually volunteered to move out west. So this is going to sound a lot like what happens to the Creeks, but in a unique way. So when we talk about what happens to the Cherokees, there is a group of the Cherokees, a small group known as the Treaty Party, made up of or led by these three men, Elias Boudinot being one of them, Elias Boudinot being the editor of the newspaper, Elias Boudinot, Major Ridge, and John Ridge. But there were also others who felt like they had no choice. These were men who didn't want to sign the treaty. They weren't thrilled about moving, but they felt like this was the only option. They had to go out west, otherwise it was going to get bad. Um, Major Ridge, listen, Major Ridge is not someone who is easily convinced that moving out west is the only option. He, 30 years before this, in 1806, he executed a chief who sold tribal land. In fact, Major Ridge also wrote a law into Cherokee, into the Cherokee law that prohibited land sales. So it's not like these guys are thrilled about selling their land or giving up their land. These are not men who um, are gaining something or profiting in some kind of way. This is not what they want, but they feel like they are forced to do it. A vast majority of the Cherokee denounce this treaty. Okay, they hate this treaty, but these three men and the others who joined them feel like they have no choice. Here's what you have to understand. Okay, when the Creeks signed their treaty and John Quincy Adams is in charge, there is an understanding that, and this applies to other tribes and other presidents, there is an understanding that only some of them are going to move. It's not going to work with all of them. It's going to take some time. In this particular situation, this treaty is signed by a minority party in the tribe. However, Jackson says, I don't care who signs it. I don't care who doesn't sign it. I don't care who agrees with it or who doesn't agree with it. If they sign the treaty applies to everyone. So these guys sign it. Some of the tribe leaves on their own terms. They leave in their own numbers and go. And then Jackson sends in federal troops and force out the rest. And that's how you get the Trail of Tears. That's the thing. When we talk about this whole process of um, this treaty signing and the impact that it makes, the division it creates will last for generations. Not just because these guys signed the treaty, but because it creates a resentment of you signed a treaty and Jackson forced us to leave and forced us to suffer in that way. And that resentment will last for generations. It's not something that's easily forgiven. It's not something that's easily moved on from. And that's something that I want you to think about. Um, this map sort of this map shows you where um, Indian removal takes place, or how Indian removal takes place, and you can see um, where they're coming from. So the Saxon and Fox's tribes move in from the Midwest. The Trail of Tears for the Cherokee, um, which is really hard fought and a struggle. And then you see the stories of other removals and how long they take. But I want to spend some time talking about the Trail of Tears and what makes um, that significant and how long of a legacy it creates. So uh, there are thousands who will die along the way. Um, Ultimately, when we talk about um, the thousands of people who move, I want to talk very quickly about the Cherokee and who all leave, because keep in mind, it's not just the Cherokee, it's also going to be the slaves that they own as well. These people were forced to leave from their homes to take only what they could carry, and only what they had and what they could pack up in the time that they had. Many of them are walking along the way, all the way from Georgia into Indian Territory. Some in and over the amount of time it takes, it's over the course of winter months. Um, Many of them die along the way and are buried along the side of the path that they take. Um, those who die include, of course, are usually the elderly or the very young, but they will also include uh, the African slaves or the black slaves. Um, it is one of the um, harshest chapters in American history. And it is something that a lot of the Cherokee are going to have a particular time, a particularly difficult time moving on from, especially when it comes to healing their own tribal division. And you can understand why. And the Cherokee are not the only one. The Seminole, for example, refused to move. The Seminole will actually fight a war known as the Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842. Over the course of 7 years, they will fight the American army. They will fight the U.S. Army to a standstill. Millions of dollars will be spent. Thousands of troops will die. In fact, 1,500 American men will die as a result of the Second Seminole War. Um, all because the Seminole don't want to leave their ancestral home. Um, when we talk about um, how much of a struggle it is, uh, just for the sake of Indian removal, um, and I would like for you to address this as well. These are the questions that I want you to consider about why they're willing to hold on, right? Because Jackson doesn't seem to understand it. Um, Jackson seems completely insensitive to it. Um, as a result, you have 90,000 people removed from their homes and sent into what is now known as, or what will be now known as, Indian Territory. Um, and you have in Indian Territory dozens of new tribes that will include the Delaware, the Ottawa, the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, the Sac and Fox, the Miami and Kickapoo nations, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, and the Cherokee. Um, and all of these tribes have now got to adjust to a brand new way of life, a brand new climate, a brand new territory, to treaties that may or may not be fulfilled and adhered to. Um, it's it's a new chapter, and it's uh, a new phase in their history, and it's a new phase in their identity as well.